Hi, and welcome to this episode 10 of the Review podcast. I'm Natalie Turner. Today we'll be talking about effective science communication with a very special guest that I have. He's also on the ICEV, one of the ICEV committees. I'll let him introduce himself in a moment. But also, just to make all the listeners aware, this will be our last episode in this season. So without further ado, I'll allow you to introduce yourself.
My name's Dylan Berger, and I'm a PhD scientist at the Ottawa Hospital in Canada, and I'm a member of the ICEV Communications Committee as well. Have been for the last year.
Perfect. Before we get started onto the theme of today, I probably want to hear a little bit about you and your research and your career so far, how you came to be where you are today.
Sure. Yeah, so I got interested in extracellular vesicles as like a comprehensive topic during my PhD. It was kind of a tangent I went off on, and then I just became so excited about it that I turned it into my postdoctoral research. So I've been studying extracellular vesicles since my postdoc started in 2009. My main focus has been on circulating extracellular vesicles as a marker of vascular injury. And molecular mechanisms governing that. I've kind of expanded into urinary extracellular vesicles. I'm at the Kidney Research Center here in Ottawa, and sort of progressively became more interested in urinary extracellular vesicles. I'm on the co-chair of the genitourinary system special interest group for ICEV as well. And yeah, so I sort of progressively built through my postdoc and interest in EVs, and was lucky enough to get hired on here in Ottawa and be able to start a career. So mostly, molecular mechanisms governing extracellular vesicle formation, usually under stress conditions. We use models of hypertension or diabetes, that sort of thing.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, sounds really interesting. I mean, as a person who's dealt with biofluids before, I understand there's a lot of complexities when
Yeah.
dealing with these complex biofluids and trying to get the EVs out away from all the stuff that you're not interested in.
Yeah.
So it sounds like within ICEV you've got these couple of different positions, and I guess as part of that you'll be having meetings, probably even conveying what you're discussing at these meetings to students, to
Yeah.
other collaborators all the time. So, in terms of trying to get your point across to people with probably very varied backgrounds and not
Yeah.
necessarily always super familiar with extracellular vesicles, how does one try and make the best out of that without overwhelming people? Because I know when I first started in the field, there's a lot to take on and it takes a long time to kind of sink in. So, as you're explaining to, let's say, students, for instance, how do you go about that?
Yeah, so my father's a psychologist. I minored in psychology in undergrad, and I've always been very big on the science of persuasion, right? And I think the keys are keeping things simple, keeping things clear. Always have a clear and focused message. We've had people talk about like the weave of going off topic and stuff like that. It's not effective. It's not effective communication. It's having really focused and clear points, and being on the nose about it. People always get worried about being too simplistic or insulting their audience. That's sort of the counter argument I've heard to this. And I think when done properly, with the best effective communicators I've found, can say something really simple that adds that little nugget of complexity to the sort of the people in the know in the room. And I think that's really what I try to strive for, is that I'm starting with the basics, but I'm adding that little level of complexity that helps others, who are sort of more looking for the more advanced detail.
Yeah, so I mean, in your role as like faculty,
Yeah.
are you teaching any courses on extracellular vesicles, or have you dropped any information on that in what you're teaching?
Yeah, I do. I teach a couple of courses on cell signaling where I focus on extracellular vesicle mediated signaling. And then I have more generic pharmacology teaching as well. But when it comes to EVs, one of the things I find is really important, and we all know this field is still struggling with this, is trying to get nomenclature across in a clear fashion, right? I think you really can't teach EVs effectively until you've addressed the nomenclature issue. And so my strategy with that has been a lot about teaching the history of EVs, right? Because these were very disparate fields that sort of came together studying EVs, and that's where a lot of the nomenclature challenges come from. And so I've sort of started at the basics of that, and certainly I find even like the effective resources out there in terms of review articles start with that, because I find that once you have that level of understanding, you can understand why the nomenclature is so important and why the nomenclature has evolved to where it is.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a very, very good point because if you go back through the history of any papers dealing with EVs for so long, everything was just an exosome.
Yeah,
And
or a
so for anyone
microparticle.
new to the field who's going back more than like the last 10, 15 years, they're going to see
Yeah.
exosomes everywhere and think, well, hang on, why did things change? So I think trying to explain that to people in a way that helps them like grasp that concept, like obviously fields change, we all learn and grow and we find out these new things, and all of a sudden we have to address that, and it is hard. And I think it's one of the big shifts in the field, or big challenges, is trying to make sure that nomenclature is on point, because if you can't get to the point where you both understand what it is you're talking about, then how can you even go any further than that? So that's, yeah, a very good point. So in terms of like I like to think about effective science communication as like if I were explain it to someone completely outside of the field,
Yeah.
and basically get them to even understand like what I'm talking about, and then go even further and try and explain the work that I have been doing, for instance. And typically that's something that you would do at a conference, not necessarily an EV conference, but
Yeah.
like say I do EVs and proteomics. So if I went to a proteomics conference and I
Yeah.
had to tell everyone about EVs, I feel like if I could get them to understand what I was talking about, then that's a win, right? So what is some of the key things, like when you're presenting work to a wider audience? What do you think some of the common mistakes are, and then how can people kind of improve on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think number one is I think just a common mistake is not regularly engaging with people who aren't in the know in your conversations, right? If I had any advice, it would be, and this certainly goes to all of my students, is to talk to family, somebody who is not at this level, and figure out what sort of the building blocks of knowledge are to get somebody to be able to talk about your research specifically. So what are those building blocks that are necessary? Because I think it's very common amongst most people what elements you're going to have to touch on. Like how do you analogize what extracellular vesicles are to somebody who has no cell biology? How do you analogize it to somebody who has a cell biology background but doesn't really know what happens at the membrane or anything like that, right? And I think if you're regularly engaging with people outside of your field, if you're not getting kind of siloed, it becomes a lot easier to do it. And I'm not innately an effective communicator, I don't think. I think I practice and practice and practice. When I was a postdoc, I think I agreed to present at our work in progress series probably 5, 6 times a year. And it was just intentional because I wanted to refine how I'm explaining things. And I think so the lack of practice is a big one, I think. Rushing to complicate things is another one, right? If a lot of people have that one slide that explains extracellular vesicles and move right on to like how it deals with your project. I go to pharmacology meetings, sort of like you were saying, you go to a proteomics meeting and explain EVs. I'm at pharmacology meetings explaining EVs, and it's the same thing. It's like if you rush too much away from that, then you've lost the audience. And most of the time, and I think most of us have experienced this, most of the time the extracellular vesicle biology is what grabs the audience's attention. Like the pharmacologists don't care about the pharmacology of the drug that's manipulating EVs. They want to know about the biology of the EVs really in depth. And so spending that time to give them, something to talk about, I think is really important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the practice thing is, you really hit the nail on the head. I mean, I feel like it's an underlying assumption for anyone who's a scientist from any field, is that we're all just these gifted communicators that we know how to talk to anyone about anything about our work, and and they'll totally understand it first time. And
Yeah.
That's just not true. Like I thought for a long time, like oh, like I'm a really strong communicator, and
Yeah.
that's just because I practiced a lot. And then I thought, oh, I can like sign up for these free courses on science communication. Like why not? It's not going to hurt.
Yeah.
And wow, I just was stunned. It's not to say like there's not different ways of doing
Yeah.
things, but even like a basic level effective communication course, I was like, wow, I really could do a lot of things differently and
Yeah.
improve in areas that, you just don't naturally think of. It's a conscious thing to revise
Yeah.
and learn and do these practices to let
Yeah.
not even like lay people like friends and family, but just people like not in the field that you're in, or in a
Yeah.
parallel field, like a biologist talking to a physicist or something. Like you can, like it's both science but very different understandings of
Yeah.
things. So yeah, so what other things do you like come to mind when you think about science communication?
Well, I mean, I think number one is that there's domains of science communication, right? And just because you're a good teacher or presenter to an audience in your area doesn't mean that you're effective at communicating on social media. And just because you're good at communicating on social media and in sort of interpersonal exchanges doesn't mean you write an effective grant, right? So it's very much about where do you want to be communicating, and then how do you get the skills? And I was always sort of raised to, I'm not always great at this, but I'm always raised to listen first and talk second. But when it comes to communication, I think that's really important. I think you need to have an idea of what effective communication is before you can be an effective communicator. I kind of fell into my sort of track of communications within scientific societies, um, without no training, and they don't train us. It's getting better at the graduate level now, I think, but they certainly didn't train us for scientific communication when I was a trainee, and they certainly don't train us enough on that even now. Um, but I was in a scientific society where I joined a new investigator committee, and I just kind of on the first meeting said I could create a Facebook page for our group, and from there I was their communications person, right? And so how do you deal with that? When I became their social media person, I had to learn how to write on Twitter. I had to learn how to be effective on Twitter. And so we had an account that I didn't post to for 3 months because I wanted to figure out what was going to be effective in terms of how I was doing that. And then sort of we built the account from there, and it grew, and I engaged some other people who were very effective and successful at communicating on Twitter at the time, and LinkedIn today probably as much as anywhere else. But it was very much learning from that spot, from that base.
Yeah, see, I'm more of a like act first, thinks.
Yeah.
And like maybe that's true for I don't know, say a lot of people, but yeah, I think I admire people who can take the time to
Yeah.
first observe and then create something. But for me with
Well, and there,
social,
and there is no harm in making mistakes as long as, depending on the nature of your
yeah,
mistake, right? And you
yeah.
have to be mindful of that. You have to be mindful of like a base level of civility and respect and that sort of thing. But if that's the case, there's no harm in. And certainly, I definitely learned by putting out ineffective Twitter posts. I learned what worked and what didn't over the years.
And it's a bit potluck at times
Yeah.
with Twitter, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's definitely a certain style that you can write in for social media that seems
Yeah.
to be yeah, you get a lot of likes and views and things like that. But
Yeah.
yeah, there's something to be said for different platforms as well, because writing something for X won't sit
Yeah.
the same as if you posted it on LinkedIn and vice
Yeah.
versa. So there's a lot of variables to be aware of, I guess, even across different social media platforms. But again, like you said, something really important, which was like you kind of find yourself in these positions that without necessarily having been formally trained
Yeah.
in any of that, and so finding the right path, it can sometimes be, I think, a little bit tricky, and I think mentorship's really important. So, in terms of finding the right people to guide you in the right direction. Did you have that experience, or it was a little bit of both, like mix? Some you had to just go for, and others you had people to guide you?
If you're mindful as you're going through this, you're going to find mentors, and I found them in a number of different ways. I probably should mention Anastasia Mihaladou, who I engaged through the International Society of Hypertension, but she basically taught me how to write on Twitter, or X, I guess, is a very effective at audience reach, incredibly effective at that, and I learned so much from her. But then, probably the best grant writing advice I ever got was a one-off comment at a training conference that I got, and the guy walked in, and he opened his lecture by saying this. He walked in, he's like, "It's 6 o'clock on a Thursday night. I've just dropped my kid off at karate class. I'm sitting down at a Starbucks, and I've just spilled coffee on myself. I'm already angry at you. That's what you should think when you're writing your grant, and from a grant writing standpoint is very much the case, right? You want to be liked by the reviewer. That's part of the persuasion in writing a grant. And it was one of the most effective pieces of advice I ever got, but like I said, it was a one-off, and I don't even remember a single second beyond that comment in his lecture,
It's
because that's
amazing
just what
what
hit
sticks
home. Yeah.
sometimes, like that little tidbit of information. So,
Yeah.
because yeah, like grant writing is different to writing a
Yeah.
paper, is
Yeah.
different to writing something that you might use as a talk. So, in terms of like, this is a good like spot to talk about grant writing tips,
Yeah.
and obviously it will vary probably depending on what type of grant you're going for, but so something, a piece of information like that, or a piece of advice like that, is there anything else that you have that you could share with people in terms of like top tip for persuade, because it's persuasion. You really
It's
have to
very much
persuade the
persuasion.
reviewers.
Yeah, it's very much persuasion. Now you have to be careful about being respectful of this, but the sort of the old adage I was always taught is, tell people you're going to tell something, tell them something, and then tell them you told something in a grant. And right, and reiteration is important. These are often big documents. If you don't hit on things multiple times, people can forget it by the time they get to a document. So that I find is a big one, where if you're on a grant panel, somebody will say, "But they didn't write anything about this," and then somebody else will be like, "Well, they did. It's in Appendix 6 over here, right? And it's the only place in the grant that's located." And quite frankly, the damage is already done by that point. Somebody's formed a score in their head, and maybe they'll revise it, but often they don't. And so, make sure your key points are reiterated without being on the nose about that. Very important. I sort of developed my style over time, identifying elements of other grants that I liked. And so I found being a reviewer was incredibly helpful. Um,
Yeah, I
you
always
just,
thought that. Yeah.
yeah. And as a early career, sometimes there isn't an opportunity to sit on panels, right? In Canada, until recently, you had to be a principal investigator, which I always thought was kind of silly, because like you're not setting people up to start on day one with those skills. But there are sort of other opportunities. I run a mock grant panel and a couple of other societies that I'm involved in, because I wanted to sort of pass on what I've learned as a chair over the years. But yeah, my grant writing style is constantly evolving, but it's very much a hybrid of, my mentors and some of the structures they used, mixed together with some of the elements I've seen in other grants being effective. And it has to be you, right? It has to be you. And so it has to become your own style eventually.
And I've heard so many times from many different people in many different workshops on grant writing that you've really got that first page, like
Yeah.
that first page summary to grab their attention.
Yeah.
And I mean, it might just be the case in Australia, but a lot of reviewers will not even look through the rest of the
Yeah.
grant if you don't catch them on that first page, because they've just got so many to review
Yeah.
that they have to make a split decision then and there, which is like kind of shocking. But again, I think I remember seeing a poll on Twitter that kind of asked the same thing. Like, if you were a reviewer and you aren't grabbed by that first page, do you continue reading the grant? or it could have even been a survey. It was something that was really like, it was a lot of views, like I think a couple 100,000 views on Twitter at least. And it said, yeah, that basically the consensus was most grants don't get read past the first page if they're not that eye catching, or they don't grab the interest of the reviewer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I probably spend more time on my first page than I do on the other 10 pages in a Canadian grant, or the equivalent in other societies. I spend a lot of time on that first page. Number one, it should cover everything, so all you're doing is elaborating. But as you say, it is what people read. So, Canadian grant panel, there are 3 people out of approximately 20 that are required to read the entire grant. And everybody on the panel who has an equal vote will usually read the summary page, and often they're reading the summary page in real time. If I'm, at least
Ooh.
my
Yeah.
assumption. I wouldn't describe that as the best reviewer practice. It's certainly not what I do, but it certainly seems like that's what's happening often, right? And so, not only do you have to be effective in communicating it, but it has to be digestible quickly. And that's not a skill that's easy. It's something that comes over time, and early on, internal grant review is really important. Having a couple of mentors who look at it, who are willing to be honest with you and tell you that it's not good, is really important.
And is it like, what would you weigh the again, I think different grants
Yeah.
give different weighting to different areas. Like some grants are completely based on your track record, more or less, like
Yeah.
your ability to carry out the work rather than the project itself, and others are
Yeah.
the reverse. So is there anything particularly that you find a common theme among the successful grants?
Yeah, I mean, so there is a phenotype of reviewer that has to like visually see a hypothesis and has to see aims. And it's a significant population. I would say probably a third of reviewers are not willing to accept an implied hypothesis. When I'm reviewing a grant, I'm kind of open to the concept of an implied hypothesis, but a lot of reviewers don't, right? So having that basic statement, and you certainly have to have, regardless of whether it is an underlined statement in the summary page, which is what I would recommend, at least in Canada, you certainly have to be able to communicate that effectively. They have to come out of that document knowing what is the central hypothesis, why is it important, and what are you going to do to attack it, right? Those are kind of the elements of it. And I find drawing attention to those things within the summary page is very important. So like I said, I often bold the central hypothesis. I'll underline the aims, or I'll structure it such that the aims are sort of segregated within the document, so that if somebody is skimming this, which I always assume somebody is doing, if somebody is skimming this, they're going to find those things quickly and be effective. And that's kind of comes back to what I was saying about, the reviewer sitting in a coffee house already being angry at you, right? If you make their life easy, they are, subconsciously or overtly are going to like your grant more, right? And so it's little things like that you can do. In the main body of the grant, don't do dense formatting, right? It gets hypnotic. People lose focus as they're going through it. Have sort of scheduled reader breaks within the main document, again, because it's just, it's like the golden rule, right? Love the reviewer as you would like them to love you, sort of thing.
Yeah, good advice. Good advice. So moving away from grants now, I think like that was very good input, but there's a few more other things I think we should get onto. So let's say now, instead of presenting work to a different audience, we're presenting work to the EV field. And because ICEV I feel like it's coming up so soon. It's still like quite a few months away, but still, I feel like this is a good time to talk about what things would make for a really strong conference presentation to, like, for instance, the ICEV community.
Yeah, I mean, the ISF community, to varying degrees and with varying angles, are all interested at first in what are your EVs? What are they? And so be clear about it. It doesn't matter usually what you've done, as long as you can make clear what they are. It doesn't matter if you've used size exclusion or density gradient or ultracentrifugation. If you can be clear about that and know what the limitations are of each of those methods, the community is going to accept it. But if you walk up there and you're not clear on how you got your EVs, what you've done to characterize your EVs, then that is often where people run into trouble, especially if they don't have an answer ready during the question period. So I think that's really key is getting to the point, and it doesn't take that much time of your presentation to be clear on what these are. You can use graphics and images to sort of illustrate the methodology often, I think is quite helpful, so people can skim that quickly. Have basic figures along the lines of what is suggested in MySev. It doesn't have to be perfect MySev, everything, but your audience needs to know what your EVs are before anything else for an EV field. That's sort of been my experience.
And of course, there's going to be differences between like whether you have an oral presentation accepted or whether you've got a poster.
Yeah.
And I think to me, from past conferences, the poster sessions can be one of the best opportunities to talk to a large number of people, but one-on-one, which makes a really big difference to how you communicate the same thing rather than to like a big audience. So do you have any like how can you adjust your presentation from talking to like a large group to just a couple of people at your poster, for instance?
Well, the first thing I'll say about posters, which has always been why I like them as a medium, is that you get an opportunity to correct or elaborate on anything that you don't say perfectly the first time, right? An oral presentation, often you have to script that quite a bit because you don't want to miss out on saying something properly. In a poster presentation, you can clarify, you can provide sort of further details on that. And so, especially if they're timed, and this goes for oral presentations as well, I always aim for less than the time. I have a plan in place for less than the time. It always goes over. And so keep it simple, keep it high level. You don't need to go into the depth as you're explaining the poster. If the person at that poster is interested, they're going to engage you meaningfully after you've given that initial overview. So provide enough details so that they know everything that you've done, but you don't have to go into the fine methodological detail always without a prompting from some sort of exchange with your either your reviewers or people who are just visiting the poster, I find.
Yeah, and I think in terms of, so I guess you've got a lot of wiggle room too, because people will like tend to hang around after you've finished presenting a poster and just talk to you. They'll talk to you more about your work, your lab, like where you're from. It's a really great networking opportunity. So do you find, like, have you yourself in the past, like, had this little back pocket elevator pitch? Like, let's say you were kind of job hunting, you're about to finish your PhD, you need a postdoc, or maybe a postdoc looking for a junior faculty position or what have you. Do you always, like, is it a good idea to have something at the ready if like a professor comes along and says, hey, what are you working on that looks interesting? Tell me more about you.
Yeah, I think so. I think you've hit the nail on the head, right? The poster is often the avenue to starting a conversation, right? And oftentimes in these exchanges, the poster can become secondary. No, you can benefit greatly from somebody who has some technical expertise who gives you some advice, but oftentimes it's, like you said, a networking opportunity. And I always wanted to be prepared to talk about where I was going next, right? You know, whether it's PhD to postdoc, postdoc to faculty. And if I wasn't, let's say 6 months into my postdoc, I probably wasn't ready to talk faculty. Then I just wanted to find ways to maintain the relationship with somebody and stay in contact, right? So, hey, we should chat, or maybe I can talk to my supervisor about inviting this person to come give a talk 6 months or a year from now. But if there is opportunities like that, it's invaluable to sort of maintain that relationship. And if there is an opportunity, if you do have, a plan for an independent research career, then, have that at the ready, right? And probably everybody thinks about that a little late. Certainly as a master's student looking at a PhD, I thought about that a little late. My PhD to my postdoc, I thought about that a little bit late. When I was a PhD student, I sat on a hiring committee, so I remedied that at the postdoctoral level, where I had a sort of job portfolio ready to go fairly early. But I think it's uncomfortable sometimes, because you're going to have self-doubt when you're looking at that next step often. But yeah, I couldn't agree more about having something ready to facilitate discussion, because you never know where opportunities are going to come from. Certainly, I did have job opportunities that came directly, at least initially, from a conversation at a poster.
Yeah, this is the thing. I mean, maybe not myself, but I had friends at these conferences who said, "Oh, I just had like three different conversations and had two job offers out of those three
Yeah.
conversations." It was, or at least the expression of interest, like, "Hey, please email me when you get
Yeah.
back, and we'll talk." And
Yeah,
um,
because it's a rare opportunity to get one-on-one time with field leaders, right? Like if usually the sort of big names in the field are walking up to posters on keywords, and if they're at your poster, they're very interested in what you're doing, right? It's impossible at something like an ISEV to go and visit every poster. Small national meetings that might be possible, but at something like off ISEV, they're looking at keywords and they're looking at topics, and you already have their attention if you're at the poster.
yeah.
And then you've got this rare opportunity for one-on-one time. And so it's probably not that surprising that this is where a lot of those opportunities for, jobs, postdocs, etc., come from.
Yeah, and I mean, when you meet someone to face, you're not just
Yeah.
an email name
Yeah.
anymore. You're a real person,
Exactly.
which makes a huge difference when it may even be 6 months later. But if you can say, "Hey, I saw you have a position advertised,
Yeah.
and I just like we met at ISEV in
Exactly.
wherever at this time, and we were talking about my poster or we were talking about something else." But having that face-to-face connection really helps a lot, I find. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, and I guess other opportunities that come around at these big meetings are, like you said, like the special interest group, or
Yeah.
obviously, like now SNEV runs the ECR events
Yeah.
at ISEV. And there's, I think, a lot more opportunity for ECRs to get involved in the society in general these days. So, would you recommend that, people start looking for these places where they can connect and even like find mentorship and things like that in these situations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so we just had ISEV announce the new mentorship
Yep.
program, and this is it's timely to be able to talk about this, but the opportunity to identify people external to your current environment who can be mentors is incredible, right? If you are applying for a job and some internationally renowned scholar is one of your references that isn't at your own institute, that draws attention. Um, and the other thing about this is that oftentimes, again, I am sort of a naturally shy person. But the opportunity to get involved on a committee or something like that, where again, you're engaging with some of these individuals, number one, it often sort of necessitates exchange where you begin to get comfortable with people and open up a little bit more. But it also gives you an opportunity to show, people in the field that you are a worker, you are a capable person, even if it's outside the realm of science, that has an impact. And the other area where I've seen a lot of people sort of get hired is, oh, we have this great person on the mentorship committee. I think they'd be a good fit as, at our institute. And so I find for networking, it's really a sort of an effective way to sort of get your foot in the door with field leaders again, because it's valuable.
Yeah, and then like let's go back to like or move forward rather to like later career stages, like you now compared to you like say 5 years ago. You're still obviously we're all learning and growing and doing these things, so
Yeah.
how do you like do you make plans for the next few years to say, okay, this is what I want to achieve, and in terms of developing like keeping the communication going and
Yeah.
strong, like you still very active in these different areas, but do you have these concrete kind of like, okay, I've got this thing I want to do in my mind, it's a goal, and like how do you go
Yeah.
about achieving that?
Yeah, and I got advice when I was first starting my independent research career to always have the 1, the 3, and the 5-year plan in your head. And one of that is just staying current and relevant, right? It is very easy in this field, and to latch onto a topic that may stay hot for a while and may not. And if you aren't nimble within the career, but even within how you're communicating to people, how you're teaching, I think it's easy to become irrelevant very quickly. And so part of my 1, 3, and 5-year plan is always like, what do I need to do? Do I need to look at teaching and when the pandemic hit, I loaded up on online teaching courses just because I knew there was going to be, number one, there was going to be a period of time where there was online teaching. But number two, I didn't think we were ever going straight back to in class 100% of the time. And so I took put a lot of effort into sort of understanding what was effective online versus in person. I still struggle with that and I'm still working on it, but very much, trying to be responsive to trends that you're seeing and making sure that you at least understand them. There are definitely fads in communication and fads in teaching, and you don't necessarily have to be in on every fad, but you have to understand fads, why they exist and where they're going.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good point. You never know how long something's going to stick around for,
Yeah,
whether it's going to be semi-permanent,
yeah.
permanent, or just a very like flash in the pan kind of situation. So, how would you judge? How would you know whether or not do you give it a period of time before you start thinking about getting involved in something like that?
Yeah, I do. I, I guess I have got involved early in many cases. Or so a good example of this is the Twitter system right now, where I think most academics agree that whatever the algorithms were, they were promoting academic content. They're not as effective as they used to be. I think that's a general consensus. And there have been some pushes to look at other avenues. And I will admit to having tried every one of them. I've tried, I tried Mastodon, I tried Threads, I gave it a chance. I am on Blue Sky. Because I do find scientific communication is getting stifled a bit on Twitter right now. Maybe that changes on X. Maybe that changes. Maybe it doesn't. But
It
um,
seems to have gone very political, and
yeah,
then I don't even know what direction it is. I've kind of check it sporadically now, enough to
exactly.
you kind of feel like, oh, like you owe it something because you spend time building this network,
Yeah,
building followers, and then to
yeah.
have to start again somewhere else, it seems. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and so and I can understand that, especially for people who built, really, really large networks on that platform. And so I try the fads, but it's one of those things where you have to give it time. I think it's reasonably clear, at least at this stage, that science is not going to threads. That did not seem to happen at all. And so I don't, that's at best it's more of a personal account at this point. It's not a lab account. Um, but I think where people are going, I definitely want to know, and I want to know early. And so I have definitely been involved in some of these fads to varying degrees of success.
And so much is timing. I
Yeah,
remember, like, I joined Blue Sky maybe 6 to 12 months ago, I think,
yeah,
when Twitter
yeah,
was going through another one of these dips. And it didn't, like, I thought people were going to go as well, but it
yeah,
didn't really take off. But now it seems to have really gotten started. And so there's a Extracellular Vesicles channel I've created. I've created a starter pack and added people. So I'll have to find you on there
yeah,
and add you to the starter pack. But it seems
yeah,
to be like this growing community, and there's a lot more options to tailor what
yeah.
you see to just a particular type of content like science or a particular field of research.
Yeah, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic there. One of the reasons I'm cautiously optimistic is that this is the first time I've seen people with like mega X accounts coming over,
Yes.
right? There was a lot of reluctance, and again, we've talked about understanding why that is, why people who built such a big network weren't moving off. This is the first time I've seen the people with the big networks coming over. I've joined for about 5 days. That's probably why we haven't found each other yet.
Ah, okay. Makes
Um,
sense.
yeah,
Yeah, there was like this mass exodus of X. Suddenly had, I had maybe like 200 followers, and
yeah,
overnight I had another few hundred. Like
yeah.
it
Yeah,
happened
exactly.
very
I've seen the
quickly.
same thing within mine is a little more kidney nephrology
Yep.
community first, and then EV probably secondary in terms of where my network has been, and
Yep.
both of those are blowing up, but the nephrology in particular has moved over quite heavily.
Yeah, and I guess just to get to the point of like why I think this is important conversation, because social media has kind of been a huge benefit to me
Yeah,
personally in networking and getting people to know who I am. Like I think that's really undervalued by people who just think like, oh, social media, like I can do without it. I mean, you can, but I think people who do without it are probably at a disadvantage. Like, you need to make yourself known, and it's too hard to keep track of. Like, people aren't going to go manually searching through like universities or institutions to find out where the extracellular vesicle researchers are, for instance. If you're posting things, you're tagging things, you're putting your research up, I think that's a really good way to get exposure. And it goes towards metrics as well, because now we have things like Altmetric and others that keep a tally of how many times your work's been posted about. And it could be you, it could be retweets or whatever, but
Yeah.
it all counts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I for a long time didn't fully appreciate the impact that social media was having on my career in terms of recognition. I've always engaged on it to varying degrees. On a fundamental level, at a very basic level, if there's nothing else you benefit from on social media, it's a bit of our white pages these days. And oftentimes, if I'm not exchanging emails with somebody regularly, the first message they get is through some social media account just to chat. I think it's possible we may have even connected on Twitter initially when we were talking, but
Probably, yeah.
exactly. So at a minimum, that is part of the benefit, right?
Yeah.
And being able to find people quickly, but there's abundant evidence that it draws attention, particularly outside of your siloed scientific field, to your work, right? And at the end of the day, most of us are doing research that's publicly funded. We have to answer to the general public on why our research is of value and why it should be done. Social media is one of those ways to be effectively reach an audience that you don't normally reach through scientific journals.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Q, like, I don't know if you remember, like, I'm probably similar generation to you, but there were journals that were just like, you get the issue every month posted, and that was the way it was delivered. Like, there was no online access option. Like, this was the fact of the matter. So to have all this at your fingertips, both you can access the journal content and like people can read things immediately,
Yeah.
or just even getting to know like who's out there, what they're doing. It's so much easier these days. So I feel like paying close attention to what you post, how you post it, and who your network is online can have a pretty positive impact if you do it the right way.
Yeah, well, and bear in mind that the sort of access to scientific information that's blown up over the course of certainly my career, it sounds like your career, it cuts both ways, right? Because now there is access to everything, and you have to find a way for your stuff to stand out. And sometimes having different ways in which people see it, it's showing up on email alerts, but on social media, having different ways in which it gets into people's radar is really important.
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, I think that's a really nice way to kind of round out the podcast today. I think that there was maybe one other thing I wanted to touch on in terms of really like paying close attention to the development of these tools and like what resources are there out there. How do you can you recommend any? Do you have to go to specific like an institution, or can you do it online, or can you get help from others, or where should you be looking if so people listening they wanted to reach out for help and maybe look for good quality courses that can help improve communication skills?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a variety of sources, and I think I always advise this with mentorship too, right? To cast a wide net. Um, I've taken a few, and I'd have to. I'm blanking on the sources, but I've taken a few online courses on just the psychology of persuasion, which I think are quite effective. I think any course on that would be useful. There's some on Coursera for sure. Um,
Yeah, Coursera is where I've seen some, and
yeah.
like storytelling is like so important as
Oh,
well. And
very
maybe
much.
that's
Yeah.
something we didn't say explicitly, but I think that is kind of goes with grant writing, goes with conference presentations, goes pretty much anything. Like you have to be able to communicate not just the facts, but tell it as a story. So it kind of like the flow is there, so people can understand how you got to where you did and
Yeah.
why it matters.
Yeah, I think my lab would be utterly shocked that I didn't say tell a story at some point in this podcast, because that's literally all I ever tell them in terms of communication.
Okay,
So
we got it.
thank you
Good.
for hitting on that, because I think it's absolutely important, and it is kind of related to what we touched on elsewhere. In terms of other resources, I don't think it ever hurts to talk to people who you find to be effective in whatever domain they're doing, right? I have a good friend who's one of the best networkers at conference I've ever seen, and I, just sat down and had a beer with him, and like, how much of this is strategy and how much of this is sort of innate, and that sort of thing, and just understanding it, because um, people generally share generously in this career. We've talked about this ISEV mentorship program. Communication is like an explicit topic that they have. If are you interested in bettering your scientific communication as a mentor or a mentee? It's a specific domain that they are going to touch on, and lots of societies. This isn't an ISEV specific thing. Lots of societies have these programs that you can go out and check out. I do think the ISEV one is really well structured from what I've seen, and I'm very excited about it from that perspective. But there's lots of resources out there for that, where societies are trying to, because most fields are interested in getting the next generation in and making sure they're successful. And so, like I said, I find people generously share with their time. And yeah, if there's something I just feel like I don't understand well, I'll just look for resources. Sometimes I start on YouTube. Sometimes I start on depending on the level of need, I'll go straight to a Coursera or some sort of online, sort of validated online course. But
Yeah.
it's all kind of mixed together into like a net of all the things resources I'm trying to use to better myself, I guess. And certainly that's what I'd advocate.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, so just I think people should just be aware. And I think no matter, it goes without saying, like, no matter how good you think you are, I think there's always room for improvement. And it's just, for me, it was very humbling,
Yeah.
because I was like, oh, but I've been doing so much, and like clearly I should have a fairly good idea.
Yeah.
No, I think I definitely could improve in lots of different areas. So, yeah. So, did you have anything else you wanted to say today before we finish up?
No, maybe I would just underscore that point, because I have had the same humbling experiences, right? At various, you think you're a varying degrees of successful communicator. I think if you've gone reasonably far in a career, you have to be somewhat effective at it. But I had a session at a conference a few years ago. I was a faculty mentor, but I participated, where they brought in somebody in advertisements to talk about how to sell your research, right? And they just tore my my thing to shreds. And there's a different perspective, but I think getting feedback from people who are willing to be honest, and being introspective and open to, I need to improve here, is key.
Yeah, I think like that's for me, it kind of sits in the same category as just like a life in academia. Like
Yeah.
you'll get humbled many, many, many
Yeah.
times over, because there will be lots of rejections, lots of input from people who say, sorry, I just didn't get it, or
Yeah.
this doesn't make sense. Or I think that's just something we have to learn to live with. But if, like, as long as it's constructive,
Well, that's
it's
exactly
for the
it.
best. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Make sure you're surrounding yourself with the people who are doing that in your best interest, right? I think the kindest thing you can do to somebody is tell them that they haven't communicated something effectively, as long as you're constructive about it. But people need to know it, right? You need to know it. I need to know it, if there's room for improvement.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, Dylan. Well, yeah, I think we can finish up there. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. So we'll say goodbye to our listeners.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.